Welcome to Big Idea Hurdly, where you can learn something new in just a few minutes. Today, we listen to Liz Truss's 10 Years to Save the West, in which we probe into the urgent need for the West to reclaim conservative principles in the face of rising authoritarianism and internal complacency. Liz Truss MP has been the Conservative Member of Parliament for Southwest Norfolk since 2010 and served as the 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the first British Prime Minister to have been educated at a state comprehensive school. Don't go away. Hurdly the editor will be right back with the story. In today's rapidly shifting global landscape, the West finds itself at a crossroads where the values and principles that once defined its strength are under threat. This erosion is not solely due to external pressures from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, but also from a growing complacency within our own societies. The West must reclaim its conservative principles, those of individual liberty, free markets, and a strong national identity, to withstand these challenges and secure its future. One of the most compelling aspects of this argument is the recognition that the West's internal decay has made it vulnerable to external threats. We have allowed ourselves to become decadent and complacent, Truss notes, believing our victories were permanent, while our adversaries prepared for the next battle. This complacency is reflected in the West's increasing acceptance of big government, high taxes, and the erosion of personal freedoms, all of which have contributed to a weakened societal fabric. Consider the rise of China as a global power. In the book, a striking story is recounted from Truss's visit to a Chinese classroom in Wuhan in 2014. She was shocked to see 11-year-olds mastering algebra that children in Britain might not learn until much later, if at all. This educational rigor, a reflection of China's long-term strategic thinking, contrasts sharply with the West's focus on self-esteem and child-centered learning. Truss saw this as a visible manifestation of how far behind the West was falling, not just in education, but in the cultural confidence needed to maintain its global standing. Another key point in the book is the idea that the West's decline is not just a matter of poor policy choices, but also of a failure to defend its core values. Truss argues that Western conservatism is under attack from inside and out. And this is evident in the way governments across Europe and North America have increasingly adopted left-wing policies under the guise of progressivism. This shift has been particularly damaging in areas like education and economic policy, where conservative principles of meritocracy and free markets have been supplanted by equality of outcome and state intervention. One of the most illustrative stories in this context is Truss's battle within the British government to reform childcare. She recalls how her attempts to introduce more flexible childcare regulations, which would have allowed for greater parental choice and reduced costs, were met with fierce resistance from within her own party and from powerful lobby groups. This resistance, she notes, wasn't about the welfare of children, but rather about maintaining the status quo, a status quo that was more about preserving power for certain groups than about improving the lives of families. This story underscores the broader theme of how deeply entrenched left-wing ideas have become in Western institutions, often to the detriment of the very people they claim to help. The West's vulnerability is also highlighted by the way it has handled international relations, particularly in response to authoritarian regimes. The book recounts the chilling moment when Truss, as Prime Minister, faced the reality of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The West's failure to act decisively in the years leading up to the invasion, she argues, emboldened Vladimir Putin. The invasion was a stark reminder that appeasement and inaction only serve to encourage further aggression. Had we acted earlier, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine, she writes, stressing the importance of a strong, united response to such threats. Furthermore, the rise of environmental activism is portrayed in the book as another area where the West has ceded ground to leftist ideology. Truss recounts her efforts to push back against what she saw as economically damaging climate policies during her time in government. One memorable story involves her attempt to block a costly UN climate conference, arguing that it was more about virtue signaling than achieving real environmental benefits. The backlash she faced, even from within her own party, was a testament to how pervasive and powerful the environmental lobby has become. Yet, Truss argues that true conservatism should embrace environmental stewardship, not through burdensome regulations, but through market-driven solutions that respect property rights and individual freedoms. These stories highlight a common thread. The West's current trajectory is unsustainable. The complacency that has taken root in our institutions, combined with the external pressures from authoritarian regimes, poses an existential threat to the values that have underpinned Western success for centuries. To reverse this decline, Truss advocates for a return to the core principles of conservatism, principles that prioritize individual liberty, economic freedom, and a strong national identity. In conclusion, as the editor of Herdly, through understanding these lessons, we can foresee a future where the West not only defends its values, but also reclaims its place as a beacon of freedom and prosperity in the world. This future demands a steadfast commitment to conservative principles and a willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it is uncomfortable or unpopular. In 10 Years to Save the West, the critical argument presented is that the West must urgently reclaim its conservative principles to withstand both internal complacency and external threats from authoritarian regimes. The book consistently underscores that the erosion of these values has left Western nations vulnerable, not just politically and economically, but culturally as well. One compelling story that encapsulates this urgency is Truss's experience during the Conservative Party leadership race. Faced with overwhelming odds and entrenched opposition within her own party, Truss was determined to push forward her vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy. At one point, she was advised to back down on her tax cuts, with critics arguing that the public wasn't ready for such bold reforms. Yet, Truss stood firm, convinced that only by revitalizing the economy and cutting the tax burden could the UK secure its future. This tenacity, despite the eventual political fallout, illustrates the kind of resolute leadership she believes is necessary to steer the West back on course. Ultimately, the book is a rallying cry for action. It challenges readers to recognize the gravity of the situation and to understand that the preservation of Western values requires a return to conservative principles. Without this, the West risks losing not only its global standing, but the very freedoms that have defined its success. This stark reality serves as a final reminder of the critical need for a strategic and determined approach to the challenges that lie ahead.